an old saying, and I'm afraid that if I'm aware of the saying, because of my age, it probably is an old saying, that, and you may have heard it, that where there's a will, that's one of them, but there's another. Where there's a will, there are relatives and attorneys. And that's kind of what we see today with our opening text from the New Testament, of where a person catcalls to Jesus out of the crowd of, will you help me settle my inheritance? I've lived long enough on earth that I've now met people who have had some of the most bitter battles with their family over inheritance. And it's terrible to hear some of the stories that come out on that. And we hear this person crying out to Jesus for help. And you can't help but wonder what's going on here. It could be the fact that this is one of the younger brothers who, according to Jewish law, watched everything go to the oldest brother. And that had to be difficult to see. And maybe he was looking for Jesus to say something about the Jewish law. It could be that it was even as much as a trap to get Jesus, to see if Jesus would side with Roman law and say, and give a different approach to inheritance than what the Jewish law said. We don't know quite if this was a trap or a genuine question, but we do know that Jesus launches into a parable of a man who has such a bountiful harvest that he tears down barns to build bigger barns and then dies as God laughs at his plans. Hence, I think it's probably from this parable that the proverb has come, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. We've probably heard that. That probably comes from this parable. And an interesting thing of the parable is we don't know who this parable is directed at. Is this parable directed at the older brother, telling him pony up and share? Or is this parable told to the younger brother saying, let go of it? There are more important things. We don't know. And we must also find ourselves thinking about the Old Testament story of Joseph. Joseph built barns and he stored things. How was that any different than this situation? Well, the difference is Joseph was storing things up for others and not for himself. Joseph, because of his faithfulness and because of his planning, an entire nation was able to endure a 7-year famine. Actually, 2 nations, Egypt and Israel. Whereas with this foolish man, he was just looking to accumulate for himself stuff. Stuff, stuff, stuff. We all have stuff to some degree or another. There isn't, I shouldn't paint in such broad terms, but it's highly unlikely that any of us are at the bare thread and minimal. That probably all of us to some extent have stuff that happens to be in a box or a closet that we haven't used for a long time. And some people make a lifestyle out of that. I think there's even a TV show out now about hoarders, of people who accumulate everything. I just heard the story within the last week, and it's always interesting how stories come to me just as I'm getting ready to speak on a particular topic. And this person came to me and they found themselves having to clean out somebody's stuff that had passed away. They had junk mail that they had kept from the 1980s. Stacked on the kitchen table. Just stuff. And so when we think of this particular parable, I think one of the things that we can all think about is allowing ourselves to be challenged with the discipline of simplicity, of becoming a minimalist with our possessions and paring down. A practical step that all of us could take would be probably going through our stuff and having sincere and honest conversation of, I probably will never wear this, I probably will never use this, and begin to pare down. Moving will do that to you, you know. But it is amazing that I remember having several moves in my life. At one point, the longest I had ever lived at an address as an adult was 3 years, because it was, you know, you get the apartment, then you get the first house, and you fix it up, sell it, get the next house. Well, anyway, somewhere in the year 2000 something, I opened a box of stuff I had moved, and the newspaper date was 1987. And it's like, do I need that stuff? And I'm sorry to say, I said, I might need this someday, and I put it back on the shelf. I should be honest with you. But there is the discipline of simplicity, of learning to pare down, of learning to be happy with less. One area that I've somewhat practiced this with is my cell phone. Because when cell phones first came out, remember you got the 2-year contract, and at the end of the contract, they somehow sell you on this, good for you, you get to upgrade now. And then you end up paying, you know, several $100s for another phone. And every couple years, I'm always doing a new phone so that I can look at a picture of a cat. And I have resisted that and have kept the cell phone longer than any other cell phone I've ever done. It's a small step, but it is a step against the consumerism that we are all led to believe is the good old God-ordained American way of consume, 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 consume. That is good for the economy, it is what the healthy lifestyle is, consume, consume, consume. We won't squirm unless I mention something specific of what tempts us. So I happen to know a few people who love Chico's. And Chico's always has a sale, don't they? You can just buy something, walk out of the store, and they already have sent you another email saying, guess what? I understand marketing, but we are bombarded with this all the time. And I think this parable does teach us to think differently about the consumerism that we're all around. I love the story of Francis of Assisi, who he just knew there was more to life. He was the son of a wealthy merchant, and he knew there was more to life, and he sought and he sought and he sought, and then when the gospel came true to him, to his father's horror, he heard that his son was in the city square giving away merchandise. And the father publicly shamed him. And in a very St. Francis way, without making a scene, he removed all of his clothes and walked away. I am not suggesting any of you try that in downtown Williamston. But that was his statement of saying, I have a new life, and I'm not about this stuff. And so I do hope that when we all go home to our chicken dinners or what have you today, that we sit and look and ask ourselves about the trajectory that we're on, and ask ourselves, can we simplify and downsize? But that isn't the main point of the text. The main point of the text is the question of, are we rich towards God? Which is why I gave the story of the beggar and the prince. Are we rich towards God, or are we like the beggar who just give a pittance of all that God has given us initially? This is the bigger question, and the one that makes me uncomfortable. I have had good examples in my life. I remember I once hosted a missionary, and he literally lived on faith. Literally lived on faith. And his faith at that time was staying with us for a short period. And he needed some socks. And he asked if we could go to Walmart to get socks. And this is how simple his lifestyle was. The smallest package that Walmart had was a 6-pack of white socks. And in all sincerity, he looked at me befuddled because he said, I don't need 6 pair of socks. And then his face lit up and he said, I can give some away. Don't ask me how many socks are in my sock drawer. I find it interesting that we're in a season of, no sooner than we lay to rest a campaign and elect politicians, then they begin campaigning for their next re-election. And I debate on whether to name names or not, but I have an article from Business Insider. It is dated April 25th, 2019, and it talks about how much candidates have donated to charity. Candidates, many of whose names we would recognize. And these are people who are asking to be our leaders, asking to be the ones that ask us to follow their lead and their direction for our country. Let me just say, and I'm hesitant to mention any names because all of the names except one are Democrat, because it's the Democrats who are running, so they've released their tax records, and President Trump has not released his tax record, so that information isn't available. But let me just give you some examples, and I won't mention I won't mention the name, but just listen to this income of one candidate Income of $366,000. Donation to charity, $1,166. Another candidate who wrote a book that sold several million copies or so, earned $1,073, gave $10,600 to charity, or less than 1% of his income. Other candidates fall in about that same. There are a couple bright spots, and here I will name names. And one bright spot is in the 2012 election, Mitt Romney had given 29% of his income, and Barack Obama had given 22%. They by far stand out as pretty unique in their group. There is also another individual whom I'm not familiar with, and I will name him just because he's a good example. Cory Booker, Democrat from New Jersey. He made $152,000, and he donated $24,000 to charity. So he gave a little more than 15%. And so when we think about this particular parable, I think we are to examine ourselves and to ask, are we rich towards God? Do we give back to the one who has given to us in the first place? Many would suggest, and there's good debate among theologians, but I tend to fall into the camp that 10% is a good standard. That even before the law was given, we find that Abraham tithed of his income. That there was something that God moved within his spirit to give, and to give at that level. And we see that continued throughout, especially the Old Testament. But it is important to remember that as we give, that is to be cheerfully given. Tina and I have a phrase, and it's happy money versus not happy money. So like, $100, for a little mini vacation or something, that's happy money, right? But $100 to get the brakes fixed on the car, that's not happy money. And the hope, and I think the call is that as we give to God, that we should consider that happy money. That's something that we give because we are joyfully giving into the kingdom of God. Look at these young people that are around us who bring us so much joy, and know that our giving has sent them to camp, that our giving has helped them to have experiences with the holy. That's a joy to be a part of and to see that. The story is told of a French aristocrat, and unfortunately I read so many sources that once I decided to use this story, I could not find it again to give him credit or give him his name. But he had kind of a similar experience where he had a great harvest. It was in a time of recession. It was in a time of famine. It was in a time of economic downturn. This was somewhere in the 1700s in France. And his barns were full, and because food was scarce, he was told, now is the time to sell. Supply and demand, the price has gone up. And without batting an eye, he said, no, now is the time to give. Wow. May we carry that attitude as we look at the things that God has given us. And may we share. I just have to, just say a few things, or just quietly just say, if you look at the finances of almost any church, and this one is included, expenses and income are always tight and often a little bit below income, often a little bit below expenses. And that keeps treasurers and finance people awake at night trying to juggle and trying to keep things. By and large, the average United Methodist gives about 3% of their income. I don't know if that's true here. I don't know if that's true at Weberville. I'm not privy to any of that information, and probably think it reasonably healthy that I'm not. But wherever our percentage is, if it's less than 10%, perhaps another thing for us to ask is, God, can I give just a wee bit more? Help me to give a wee bit more to your work. And maybe have as a goal at some point to get to 10%. I think this text is often used as a way of shaming and as a way of guilting people, and I don't think that that is the intent of the text. I think the text is that Jesus is speaking and once again challenging us to ask ourselves, where is our treasure? Where are our priorities? Do we love the Lord our God with our heart, our mind, our soul, and our pocketbooks? Do we follow in every way that Jesus calls us? The prayer is that we will all say yes, and that we will all be faithful, and that God will use our time, our talents, and our treasures to bring about the good news of Jesus Christ to this community and to the ends of the world. Amen.
Amen.
We have the opportunity to share in Holy Communion a few words about Holy Communion. This is the Lord's table. This isn't Marty's table. It isn't Crossroads table. This is a table that is open to all. All who wish to be in love with God and in love with neighbor. We understand that some, for some reason, may feel that to choose not to partake of communion. Understand that we would respect your decision, but we just want you to know that the table is open and that we aren't the ones saying don't come. The table is open. We also have a gluten-free option for any who will need that. We come by way of kind of exit out the sides or come down by way of the center aisle, pick up a piece of bread, dip it into the cup, and partake of it. At which point the altar is then open for prayer if you wish to pray. Otherwise, you can then quietly return back to your seat. We're going to share together in a communion liturgy, and let us begin with our worship of God in remembrance of what the Lord has done. Brothers and sisters in Christ, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lift up your hearts.
We lift them up to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right to give our thanks and praise.
It is right and a good and joyful thing always and everywhere to give thanks to you, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. You formed us in your image and breathed into us the breath of life. When we turned away and our love failed, your love remained steadfast. You delivered us from captivity, made covenant to be our sovereign God, and spoke to us through your prophets, who looked for